If you wanted to measure the intelligence of the people in this lecture, would the size of the participants' feet be an appropriate measure of intellect? So how would you more accurately measure students' intelligence? Perhaps it's your university GPA, scores on an IQ test and so forth. Similarly, if I wanted to measure the depression in the elderly, their running speed would probably not be a good indicator. A better indicator might be the number of times they cried in the last 2 weeks, or a person's score on the Beck depression inventory. While these may seem obvious, psychologists have spent much time questioning the validity of the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the TAT or the thematic apperception test, or the Rorschach ink blot, and whether they tap into personality in the same way as a reliable and valid assessment such as the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory or the MMPI-2. Similarly, if a questionnaire we're administering claims to be a valid measure of introversion, but studies show that it's actually really measuring anxiety, then this measure is not valid. Or if a questionnaire is claiming to measure intelligence, but it's actually measuring motivation, then its validity is compromised. Validity is the extent to which a measure assesses what it claims to measure. Do the items about extroversion measure extroversion? Do all of the items measure this thing we call personality? Does the intelligence test actually measure intelligence? You can see that this all comes back to the importance of knowing what our theory and definitions are, because that will influence how we develop the assessment and therefore how valid it is. If your scores on the end of semester examination in this unit were based on what colour your hair was or on the test of general intelligence, then it would not be a valid test of your learning in this unit. To help us determine whether an assessment measures what it's actually intended to measure, there are different types of validity we can look at. These include construct validity, face validity, content validity, and criterion-related validity. Let's look at these in turn. A construct is an abstract psychological phenomenon that researchers infer from observable behaviour. Common constructs in the psychological literature include things like personality, love, aggression, intelligence, motivation, depression. Construct validity is the degree to which a study measures and manipulates the underlying elements that the researcher aims to be measuring and manipulating. Now imagine that a researcher is studying depression in university-age students. How might I measure depression? Would I measure their depression by how many friends they have or how talkative they are in social gatherings? Probably not. I would probably want to use a measure of depression with something that taps into the construct of depression. Some measures of depression, such as the Beck depression inventory, tend to have high construct validity. In other words, they tap into or measure depression accurately. However, using the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, which may be a reliable and valid measure of self-esteem, but it doesn't accurately measure depression. So it has a low construct validity. So if an intelligence test had perfect construct validity, then intelligence tests are measuring intelligence and nothing else. And any individual differences in IQ would be due to differences in intelligence and nothing else. In reality, this is not likely, as individual differences could be a result of motivation, educational background, cultural background, and many other things. To what extent does the NEO, a commonly used personality assessment, measure personality? And that, of course, depends on how we define personality and for what purpose. To what extent do intelligence tests measure what we call intelligence? Again, that depends on our definition and, as we'll see later, the context in which it's given or in which it's been measured in. So it may be valid for most people, but it might not be valid in particular cultural contexts. Many psychological researchers consider construct validity the most important type of validity in science because it embraces all other types of validity. Face validity is about the surface content of the test. In other words, does the test have face value? You might have heard this term before. If at the end of semester I asked you about obscure facts in the textbook, or not even in the textbook, that were not related at all to what we had studied in class, then would you say the test is not valid? For the most part, you probably would say it's invalid. It does not measure your learning in this unit, given that it was not related to what we were teaching. Similarly, think about your definition of intelligence or your definition of personality. Just think back to that for a moment. If you were going to construct a test of each of these, what kinds of questions would you ask? What items would you place in the intelligence test? Which items would you place in the personality test? Would you have items that are supposed to measure intelligence in the personality test? Hopefully not. So this basic kind of validity is about whether it looks right. To take an example of an item with a low face validity from a structured personality test, can you guess what personality trait the following item assesses? And the item is, I think newborn babies look very much like little monkeys. The answer is nurturance. That is, a tendency to care for others, with a true answer reflecting low nurturance and a false answer reflecting high nurturance, although few people who take the test can figure that out. Similarly, in the original MMPI developed by Hathaway and McKinley, they have questions like your bowel movements and other things that you may not want to respond to honestly about, if at all. Apart from not wanting to reply or to respond to a question like that, that MMPI item actually possesses low face validity, because you're not sure what that item around bowel movements is actually measuring. Content validity refers to whether the items on a test measure all the knowledge or skills that are assumed to underlie the construct of interest. For example, an educational test with a strong content validity will represent subjects actually taught to students rather than asking unrelated questions. Just think about the WACE 4, which is a measure of intelligence. There's a subtest of the WACE that measures arithmetic skills, in other words, mathematical reasoning skills. In this subtest, to have reasonable content validity, we would not want to just have addition problems. For better content validity for this subscale, we'd want to include things like subtraction problems, division problems, and probably some fractions as well. Criterion validity, also known as predictive validity, is really about how well one test predicts other outcomes. A simple example is whether your university entrance score predicts your study outcomes. We'd hope it would, otherwise we wouldn't use university entrance scores as a basis for your entry into some programs. Many schools of medicine also have their own assessment procedures which are predictive of students' success throughout the program. IQ scores, they do a good job of predicting academic success. They correlate about 0.5 with grades in high school and university. However, since this correlation is considerably less than 1.0, what does this tell you? It tells us that there's more to academic success than IQ. Motivation, intellectual curiosity, and effort play crucial roles in academic success, apart from IQ. IQ also predicts performance across a wide variety of occupations, with the average correlation again being about 0.5. By comparison, the correlation of IQ to how well people do in job interviews and job performance is about 0.15, which is ironic given that most employers place heavier weight on interviews than on IQ when selecting job applicants. The correlation between IQ and job performance is higher in more mentally demanding occupations, such as a doctor or lawyer, than in less demanding or less mentally demanding occupations. IQ also predicts real-world behaviours outside of the classroom or the workplace. For example, IQ is associated with health outcomes, including sickness. However, there is a potential confound here, as IQ is also negatively associated with social class, as poorer people tend to have lower IQs. So it may be poverty rather than IQ that explains the negative correlation between IQ and health outcomes.